The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Mitchell stood at the front of her classroom at Atlanta Central High School. 28 pairs of eyes focused on her, but her attention kept drifting to Maya Robinson's natural Afro hair, which stood out prominently among the students. Sarah's fingers tightened around her dry erase marker as she tried to concentrate on writing the day's agenda on the whiteboard. The classroom was arranged in neat rows, with motivational posters carefully aligned on pale blue walls. Everything had its place in Sarah's world, except, it seemed, for what she considered non-traditional appearances. Her conservative upbringing in a small Georgia town had ingrained certain expectations about appropriate school appearance, and Maya's confident display of her natural hair challenged these deeply held beliefs. During the morning's lesson on school discipline, Sarah distributed a newly revised handbook of school rules. She walked between the desk rows, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. "Personal presentation is crucial for maintaining a professional learning environment," she announced, her voice carrying an edge of authority. "Hair should be neat, controlled, and appropriate for an academic setting." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Maya sat up straighter, her hand rising steadily into the air. Sarah initially pretended not to notice, continuing with her lecture about proper school attire and grooming standards. But Maya's hand remained raised, unwavering. "Yes, Maya?" Sarah finally acknowledged, her tone clipped. Maya spoke with quiet confidence. "Ms. Mitchell, could you clarify what you mean by appropriate hair? Because my natural hair is part of my cultural identity. It's not unprofessional, it's who I am." The classroom fell silent. Other students watched the exchange, some nodding in agreement with Maya, others looking down at their desks to avoid involvement. Sarah felt her control of the classroom slipping away. "This isn't about cultural identity," Sarah responded, her voice growing tighter. "This is about maintaining proper standards. Your hair is distracting." Maya stood up, her textbook clutched to her chest. "Distracting to whom? My hair doesn't prevent anyone from learning. If someone's distracted, maybe they need to examine their own biases." The tension in the room became palpable. Sarah's face flushed red as she pointed to the door. "That's enough. Please leave the classroom, Maya. We can discuss your attitude with the administration." Maya gathered her belongings, her movements deliberate and dignified. As she walked toward the door, several classmates exchanged worried glances. The sound of the closing door echoed through the silent classroom, marking a moment that would set off a chain of events neither Sarah nor Maya could have anticipated. Outside in the hallway, Maya's footsteps grew fainter as she headed toward the administration office. Back in the classroom, Sarah attempted to resume her lesson, but the empty seat served as a glaring reminder of what had just transpired. Little did she know that Maya's mother, Carla Robinson, was not just any parent. She was the president of the school board, and news of this incident would reach her desk within hours. The remaining students watched as Sarah struggled to maintain composure, her hands slightly shaking as she turned back to the whiteboard. The morning sun streaming through the windows cast shadows across the room, highlighting the division that had just been created in what was once a unified classroom. Maya walked quickly through the empty hallway to the student lounge, where she found her friends Jasmine and Taylor already waiting for her. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone, but her voice remained steady as she recounted what had happened in Ms. Mitchell's classroom. "I can't believe she actually kicked you out," Jasmine said, pulling up their group chat. The screen lit up with rapid-fire messages as more friends joined the conversation. "This isn't just about you anymore, Maya. This is about every student who's ever felt they had to change themselves to fit in." Taylor, who had been quietly typing on her phone, looked up. "I've started a social media post about what happened. We need to make this public." She showed them the draft. Today, at Atlanta Central, a teacher expelled a student for wearing her natural hair. RT to support Natural hair belongs. Within an hour, the hashtag began gaining traction. Students from other classes checked their phones during breaks, and the story spread through the school's social networks. Maya's phone buzzed constantly with notifications as more students, then parents, and finally local community activists began sharing their own experiences with discrimination. The movement grew beyond just hair discrimination. Students began sharing stories about various forms of cultural suppression they'd experienced in educational settings. A sophomore named Marcus posted about being told his braids weren't professional. An Asian student named Lisa shared how she'd been discouraged from wearing traditional clothing during cultural celebrations. By lunchtime, the school administration couldn't ignore the growing digital storm. Principal Roberts called an emergency meeting with the department heads, including Sarah Mitchell. They gathered in the conference room, where the tension was visible on every face. "This is becoming a PR nightmare," Principal Roberts said, sliding printouts of social media posts across the table. "Ms. Mitchell, we need to address this immediately." Sarah sat rigid in her chair, her face impassive. "I was simply enforcing our dress code policy," she insisted, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "The rules clearly state—" "The rules," interrupted Vice Principal Chen, "need to be examined for potential bias. We're getting calls from parents, community leaders, and even local media." Outside the conference room, students had organized an impromptu meeting in the cafeteria. Maya's friends had created a digital petition demanding changes to the school's dress code policies. Signatures were accumulating rapidly, accompanied by comments from students, alumni, and community members sharing similar experiences. The administration's concern grew as they monitored the situation. The movement had tapped into a deeper well of frustration about institutional discrimination. Students were now organizing a peaceful protest for the following day, planning to wear their natural hairstyles proudly as a statement of cultural identity and resistance. Sarah Mitchell remained adamant about her decision, even as her colleagues exchanged worried glances. She didn't realize that her next class would be half empty, as students chose to sit in silent protest in the hallway instead. The school day ended with an uneasy tension hanging in the air. Students dispersed, but their phones kept buzzing with updates, plans, and messages of support. The hashtag had reached local news organizations, and reporters were beginning to make inquiries. What started as a single confrontation in a classroom had evolved into something much larger. As Maya headed home that afternoon, surrounded by supportive friends, she hadn't yet heard that her mother, Carla Robinson, was about to receive dozens of emails about the incident. The school board president's involvement would take this movement in an unexpected direction, and Sarah Mitchell's world was about to be shaken to its core. Carla Robinson sat in her home office, her finger hovering over her keyboard as she read the 20th email about her daughter's expulsion. As president of the school board, she was used to handling difficult situations, but this one struck at both her professional and personal life. She took a deep breath and began composing an email to the entire school board. Emergency meeting required. Discriminatory incident at Atlanta Central High School. Agenda: discussion of recent classroom expulsion and review of current appearance policies. Attendance mandatory. In her adjacent bedroom, Maya was telling her mother the full story. Carla listened intently, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. As a woman who had fought her way to her current position, she recognized the deeper implications of what had happened. "Mom, I didn't do anything wrong," Maya said, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. "My hair is just my hair." Carla pulled up the school's official policies on her laptop. "I know, baby. And we're going to address this systematically." She began highlighting sections of the dress code that contained potentially discriminatory language, preparing her argument with the precision of someone who had spent years navigating educational politics. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah Mitchell received the meeting notification on her phone while grading papers. Her hand froze mid-mark as she saw Carla Robinson's name in the sender field. The realization that she had expelled the school board president's daughter hit her like a physical blow. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Sarah arrived early, finding the boardroom already half full with administrators and board members speaking in hushed tones. When Carla entered, the room fell silent. She carried a thick folder of documents and was followed by 2 civil rights attorneys from the local NAACP chapter. "Before we begin," Carla announced, her voice professional but firm, "I want to make it clear that I'm here in 2 capacities, as the school board president and as a mother whose child has faced discrimination in our institution." She proceeded to present a comprehensive overview of hair discrimination in schools, complete with statistics, legal precedents, and personal testimonies she had gathered overnight. The attorney supplemented her presentation with references to recent legislation against hair discrimination in other states. Sarah sat rigidly in her chair, feeling increasingly isolated as the presentation continued. Her traditional allies on the board seemed to be avoiding eye contact with her. Principal Roberts, who had initially defended her decision, was now taking copious notes about policy changes. "Ms. Mitchell," Carla said, finally addressing her directly, "would you care to explain your actions yesterday?" The room waited. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but her usual confident defense of traditional standards suddenly felt hollow in the face of such well-documented discrimination. "I was following school policy," she managed to say. "A policy," Carla responded, "that we will be reviewing and revising immediately." She distributed copies of proposed changes to the dress code, along with a mandatory cultural sensitivity training program for all staff. As the meeting progressed, Sarah felt her control slipping away. Each point Carla made was backed by data, legal precedent, or powerful personal testimony. The other board members nodded along, occasionally adding their own suggestions for policy reform. By the meeting's end, Sarah understood that this wasn't just about one student or one incident anymore. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically, and her traditional approach to discipline and appearance was being dismantled in front of her eyes. The meeting concluded with a unanimous vote to suspend all appearance-related disciplinary actions pending a complete policy review. Sarah left the boardroom feeling both professionally and personally shaken, not yet knowing that this was just the beginning of a transformation that would challenge everything she thought she knew about education and inclusion. Sarah found herself in the empty teacher's lounge during her free period, staring blankly at her untouched coffee. The morning's board meeting had left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. James Parker, her colleague of 15 years who taught history down the hall, noticed her distress as he entered the room. "Rough morning?" he asked, pulling up a chair. James had always been the unofficial counselor among the staff, known for his balanced perspective and willingness to listen. Sarah looked up, her usual composed facade cracking. "I don't understand, James. Everything I've done has been by the book. Every rule I've enforced has been written in our policies. How did I end up being painted as the villain?" James considered his words carefully before responding. "Sometimes being right by the book doesn't mean being right by people. Those policies you're defending, have you ever wondered who wrote them and why?" The question hung in the air as Sarah recalled her own family's history. Her grandmother, an Irish immigrant, had changed her name and hidden her accent to secure a teaching position in the 1950s. Sarah had never made the connection until now. "I had to suppress parts of myself too," she admitted quietly, the revelation surprising even her. "My grandmother, she always told me to fit in, to follow the rules, to not stand out. Maybe that's why I've been so insistent on everyone following these standards." James leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Diversity isn't a threat to education, Sarah. It's an enhancement. Look at my AP history class. Since we started incorporating more diverse perspectives, Engagement has skyrocketed. Students see themselves in the curriculum. Sarah's hands tightened around her coffee cup. But structure, discipline, standards, these things matter in education. They do, James agreed. But whose standards are we upholding? And at what cost? When Maya stood up in your class, she wasn't just defending her hair. She was defending her right to exist as herself in an educational space. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of students gathering outside for the lunchtime protest. Through the window, Sarah could see dozens of students, many wearing their natural hair proudly, holding signs that read, "My culture is not a distraction," and "Education shouldn't require erasure." "I've spent 20 years teaching," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. "I thought I was helping these kids prepare for the real world. But maybe I've been preparing them for a world that needs to change." James nodded. "That's the first step. Recognizing that our experiences and biases shape how we teach. The question is, what are you going to do with that recognition?" Sarah pulled out her phone and showed James the email she'd received from Carla Robinson requesting a private meeting. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Carla isn't just Maya's mother or the board president. She represents everything I've been resistant to." "Or," James suggested, "she represents an opportunity to learn and grow. You're a good teacher, Sarah. Good teachers never stop learning." The bell rang, signaling the end of their free period. As they gathered their things, Sarah made a decision. "I'm going to meet with her," she said, typing a response to Carla's email. "I need to understand." James smiled. Understanding is where change begins. And Sarah, remember that changing your mind isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of growth. As Sarah walked back to her classroom, she passed Maya in the hallway. For the first time, she really looked at her student, not through the lens of rules and regulations, but as a young woman proud of her identity. The discomfort she felt wasn't from Maya's appearance anymore, but from the recognition of her own prejudices. The morning sun cast long shadows across Atlanta Central High's front lawn as students began gathering for the planned protest. What started as a small group of Maya's friends had evolved into hundreds of students, parents, and community members. They carried signs, wore traditional cultural attire, and displayed their natural hair proudly. Local news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes stretching toward the sky. A reporter from Channel 11 adjusted her microphone, preparing to go live. "We're here at Atlanta Central High School, where a controversy over hair discrimination has sparked what appears to be a larger conversation about cultural acceptance in educational institutions." Sarah Mitchell watched from her second-floor classroom window, her hands gripping the windowsill. The crowd below had grown larger than anyone had anticipated. Students from neighboring schools had joined the protest, many sharing their own stories of facing similar discrimination. Among the protesters, Maya stood with a megaphone, her voice clear and strong. "We're not here to fight. We're here to educate. Our identity is not a distraction. Our culture is not a disruption. We belong in these classrooms exactly as we are." The crowd responded with cheers and raised signs. Parents who had taken the day off work stood shoulder to shoulder with their children. Community leaders from various cultural organizations had arrived to show support. The local NAACP chapter had set up an information booth about the Crown Act, legislation protecting against hair discrimination. Principal Roberts paced in his office, fielding calls from the district superintendent and local media. The school's social media accounts were flooded with messages of support from across the country. What had begun as a single incident in one classroom had touched a nerve in the national conversation about inclusion in education. Outside, different student groups took turns sharing their experiences. A Sikh student spoke about being pressured to cut his hair despite its religious significance. A Native American student described being told her traditional braids weren't professional enough for a school presentation. Each story added another layer to the growing movement. The administration's initial response, a hastily written statement about reviewing current policies, was met with skepticism from the protesters. They demanded concrete changes, explicit protection for cultural expression in the dress code, mandatory cultural sensitivity training for staff, and the creation of a student-led diversity council. Sarah felt the pressure mounting as she recognized faces in the crowd. Former students who had likely felt silenced in her classroom, parents she had dismissed during conferences, colleagues who had tried to raise these issues before. The weight of years of enforcing discriminatory policies, however unintentionally, began to settle on her shoulders. A group of teachers, led by James, had joined the protest during their free periods, wearing buttons that read, "Teachers for Change." Their presence sent a powerful message about the divide within the school itself, between those clinging to traditional standards and those pushing for progress. The local media coverage expanded throughout the day. Social media hashtags trended regionally, then nationally. Other schools in the district began reporting similar student movements. The protest had become a catalyst for a larger conversation about institutional change. As the day progressed, the atmosphere shifted from protest to celebration of diversity. Students shared cultural music, dance, and stories. The school's courtyard had transformed into a vibrant display of multicultural pride. Even some initially skeptical teachers found themselves drawn into conversations about creating a more inclusive educational environment. By late afternoon, the school board announced an emergency session to address the protesters' demands. Sarah, watching the announcement on the local news, realized that maintaining the status quo was no longer an option. The community had spoken, and their voice was too powerful to ignore. The school board meeting room was packed beyond capacity. Community members lined the walls, reporters crowded the back, and a live stream was set up for the overflow crowd, watching from the hallway. Sarah Mitchell sat in the front row, a prepared statement trembling in her hands. When board president Carla Robinson called the meeting to order, the room fell into an expectant silence. The agenda was simple but momentous, addressing the protests and implementing immediate policy changes. Sarah had requested to speak first, surprising many who expected her to maintain her defensive stance. As she approached the podium, Sarah could feel hundreds of eyes on her. Maya and her friends sat in the second row, their presence a reminder of how a single classroom incident had sparked a movement. Taking a deep breath, Sarah set aside her prepared statement and spoke from her heart. "I've spent 20 years teaching students to think critically," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Yet I failed to apply that same critical thinking to my own actions and beliefs. I enforced rules without questioning their origin or impact. I confused uniformity with unity." The room remained silent as she continued. "Yesterday, a student asked me who these standards were protecting. I didn't have an answer then. But now I understand. They weren't protecting anyone. They were perpetuating a system that forces students to choose between their education and their identity." Sarah turned to face Maya directly. "I owe you an apology, not just for that day in class, but for every time I made you or any other student feel that your identity was a problem to be solved rather than a strength to be celebrated." Some board members shifted uncomfortably as Sarah addressed the systemic nature of the problem. She outlined specific instances where traditional policies had marginalized students and proposed concrete changes, eliminating discriminatory dress code language, implementing cultural competency training, and creating student-led diversity initiatives. The applause that followed her speech was scattered at first, then grew stronger. Carla Robinson stood up, her expression both surprised and appreciative. "Ms. Mitchell, would you be willing to join our newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee?" However, not everyone was convinced. Board member Richard Thompson interrupted. "This is an overreaction. We can't change established policies because of one incident." The room tensed, But before Carla could respond, several students stood up, ready to share their stories. Each account strengthened the case for change, demonstrating that Maya's experience wasn't isolated, but representative of a broader problem. The board voted on immediate policy changes, suspending all appearance-related disciplinary actions, initiating a comprehensive policy review, and establishing mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff. The vote wasn't unanimous. 3 conservative board members opposed, but it was enough to begin transformation. As the meeting concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by students and parents, many sharing their own experiences and thanking her for speaking up. The local news captured the moment when she and Maya shook hands, a simple gesture that symbolized the possibility of change. Outside the meeting room, James waited to congratulate her. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Real change takes time and continuous effort." Sarah nodded, watching as Carla Robinson discussed implementation plans with other board members. "I know," she replied, "but for the first time, I feel like I'm on the right side of that change." The school gymnasium had been transformed into a workshop space, with round tables replacing the usual sports equipment. Teachers, administrators, and staff members from across the district filled the room for the first mandatory diversity training session. At the front, Sarah Mitchell stood beside Carla Robinson, an unlikely alliance that had become the face of institutional change. "Welcome to our first cultural competency workshop," Carla began, her voice carrying authority and warmth. "Today isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about understanding and growth." Sarah stepped forward, her perspective as a reformed traditionalist lending credibility to the program. Many of us were taught that treating everyone the same meant treating everyone fairly, but true equity means recognizing and celebrating our differences. The workshop began with an exercise in unconscious bias. As educators shared their experiences, a pattern emerged of well-intentioned actions that had inadvertently marginalized students. During a small group discussion, a veteran teacher broke down in tears, recounting how he had asked a Muslim student to remove her hijab during a school play. "I thought I was helping her fit in," he admitted. "I never considered I was asking her to erase part of her identity." During the lunch break, Sarah was approached by Marcus Johnson, a former student who had graduated 5 years ago. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, "I never thought I'd see you leading something like this. I spent my entire senior year straightening my hair because I thought that's what success looked like." His words hit Sarah hard. How many students did I impact without realizing it? She wondered aloud during the afternoon session. Our silence and compliance were forms of violence. The training expanded beyond hair discrimination to address various forms of cultural expression, religious practices, and gender identity. Carla brought in experts from different communities to share their perspectives. Sarah focused on practical classroom applications, helping teachers revise their syllabi and classroom management strategies. As weeks passed, the impact became visible. Teachers began incorporating diverse perspectives into their lessons. The English department expanded its reading list to include more multicultural authors. The dress code was completely rewritten with student input. During one particularly powerful session, Sarah shared her own family's history of assimilation. "My grandmother used to say, 'Keep your head down and follow the rules.' I internalized that message so deeply that I became an enforcer of the very system that had oppressed my own family." The partnership between Sarah and Carla grew stronger as they navigated challenges together. When budget concerns threatened the program, they worked late into the night, preparing presentations that demonstrated the tangible benefits of inclusive education. Test scores were up, disciplinary incidents were down, and student engagement had improved significantly. However, their success also attracted attention from conservative groups who viewed the changes as threatening. Anonymous emails suggested that Sarah had betrayed her principles. Carla faced accusations of using her position to push a personal agenda. During a particularly difficult week, Sarah discovered notes of support from students posted on her classroom door. "Thank you for learning with us," one read. "Your change gives us hope," said another. The program's pivotal moment came when a student-led panel shared their experiences with the school board. Maya, now a senior leader in the Diversity Council, spoke about the transformation she had witnessed. "A year ago, I was kicked out of class for being myself. Today, I'm helping shape policy to ensure no one else has to face that choice." As the first semester under the new policies drew to a close, Sarah and Carla sat in the empty gymnasium after another successful workshop. "Did you ever imagine we'd be here?" Carla asked. Sarah shook her head. "No, but I'm grateful for the journey, even the painful parts. Especially the painful parts. They led us here." The school auditorium buzzed with excitement during the Celebrating Our Identity event. Student artwork depicting cultural heritage lined the walls, and the stage was set for presentations from various student groups. This was more than a celebration. It was a testament to how far Atlanta Central High had come in one semester. Maya and her friends had organized the event as part of the new Student Diversity Initiative. The program included personal stories, cultural performances, and a showcase of the policy changes that had transformed the school. Sarah Mitchell sat in the front row, next to Carla Robinson, both women beaming with pride. "First," Maya began from the podium, "we want to recognize those who helped make this change possible." She gestured to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, would you please join us on stage?" Sarah walked up, her eyes widening at the standing ovation she received. Students she had taught over the years stood up one by one, each sharing how her transformation had impacted them. When Ms. Mitchell apologized and began advocating for change, one student said, "It showed us that growth is possible, that people can learn and change their minds when presented with new perspectives." The celebration continued with performances. A group of students performed traditional African dances. Another shared spoken word poetry about their immigrant experiences, and a student band played fusion music blending different cultural styles. The energy in the room was electric, a physical manifestation of what inclusive education could achieve. However, outside the auditorium, a small group of protesters had gathered. They carried signs reading, "Preserve traditional values," and "Stop the political agenda in our schools." Leading them was Thomas Bradford, a prominent local conservative activist and parent. Inside, Sarah delivered her speech, unaware of the growing tension outside. "Education should lift students up, not tear them down," she said. "We're not just teaching subjects, we're preparing students to thrive in a diverse world." The celebration was interrupted by raised voices from the hallway. Bradford and his supporters had entered the building, demanding to be heard. "This school has abandoned academic excellence in favor of social engineering," he announced loudly. Security moved to intervene, but Maya stepped forward. "Sir, would you like to join us? See what we're actually doing here? Because this isn't about abandoning excellence, it's about redefining it to include everyone." The tension in the room was palpable. Some parents stood protectively near their children, while others filmed the confrontation on their phones. Bradford hesitated, clearly not expecting such a direct invitation. Carla Robinson stepped in, her presence commanding respect. "Mr. Bradford, you're welcome to observe, but this is a student event. They've worked hard to create this space for sharing and learning." The protesters ultimately remained, watching as student after student demonstrated how embracing their identity had improved their academic performance and school engagement. Test scores and college acceptance rates flashed across the screen, all showing marked improvement under the new policies. Yet the incident cast a shadow over the celebration. During the reception afterward, Sarah overheard worried conversations among parents and staff. The opposition was organizing, gathering signatures for a petition to reverse the policy changes. "We knew this wouldn't be easy," Carla said quietly to Sarah as they watched students and parents mingle. Change never is. But look at what these students have accomplished when given the chance to be themselves. Sarah nodded, but her concern was evident. They'll try to frame this as a decline in standards, she replied. We need to be prepared. As the evening wound down, Maya approached them with a group of students. We've been talking, she said, her expression determined. We want to document everything. The improved attendance, the higher grades, the increased participation. We won't let them undo what we've built. The celebration had become a rallying point, not just for what had been accomplished, but for the battles still ahead. As Sarah helped clean up afterward, she found a note from one of Bradford's supporters. This isn't over. The school board meeting room was filled beyond capacity, with tension thick in the air. Thomas Bradford and his newly formed Traditional Education Values Group had gathered enough signatures to force a special hearing about the diversity program. Local news cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking ominously. Bradford stood at the podium, his voice carrying practiced authority. In the name of diversity, we've abandoned academic rigor. Our children need structure, discipline, and standards, not social experiments. He gestured to a PowerPoint presentation showing cherry-picked data about disciplinary incidents and test scores taken out of context. Sarah sat beside Carla, both women maintaining professional composures despite the mounting attacks. They had anticipated this challenge, spending weeks preparing their defense of the program. What they hadn't expected was the personal nature of the accusations. Ms. Mitchell's dramatic change of heart, Bradford continued, his tone dripping with sarcasm, seems less about genuine conviction and more about political survival. She's abandoned her principles to appease a vocal minority. The room erupted in murmurs. Sarah felt her face flush, but before she could respond, Maya stood up. Permission to address the board, she requested formally. Carla nodded, and Maya approached the podium with quiet dignity. Mr. Bradford talks about abandoning principles, Maya began, her voice steady. But what principles are we really discussing? The principle that students should hide who they are. The principle that diversity threatens education. She pulled out a folder of documents. I have here our school statistics from the past 6 months. College acceptance rates up 12%. Student attendance improved by 15%. Disciplinary incidents down by 30%. These aren't social experiments. These are real results from students who finally feel seen and valued. Bradford attempted to interrupt, but Maya continued. You say we need structure and standards. We agree. But those standards shouldn't require us to erase our identity. When Ms. Mitchell changed her position, it wasn't about politics. It was about growth. She showed us that real strength lies in being willing to learn and change. The tension escalated when one of Bradford's supporters stood up, pointing accusingly at Maya. This is exactly the problem. Students thinking they can lecture adults about education. In my day. In your day, Carla interrupted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Many of us wouldn't have been allowed in this school at all. Is that the tradition you're so eager to preserve? The room fell silent. Carla stood, commanding attention without raising her voice. As board president, I've reviewed every piece of data, every incident report, every parent complaint. This program hasn't lowered our standards. It's elevated them by recognizing that excellence comes in many forms. Sarah finally rose to speak, her voice trembling slightly, but growing stronger with each word. When I enforced the old policies, I thought I was maintaining standards, but I was actually maintaining barriers. The students have taught me that true education isn't about forcing everyone into the same mold. It's about creating an environment where everyone can excel as themselves. The meeting continued for hours, with testimonies from students, parents, and teachers on both sides. But the turning point came when Bradford, frustrated by the mounting evidence of the program's success, lost his composure. This isn't about hair or culture, he snapped. "This is about maintaining order. These people—" He caught himself, but the slip was telling. The room erupted in outrage as his true motivations became clear. Maya stood again, calm in the face of his anger. "Mr. Bradford, you just proved exactly why this program is necessary. These people are your neighbors, your children's classmates, your community. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for equal respect." As the meeting drew to a close, the board prepared to vote on Bradford's proposal to reverse the policy changes. The outcome would determine not just the future of Atlanta Central's diversity program, but potentially set a precedent for schools across the district. The tension in the boardroom reached its peak as members prepared to vote on Bradford's proposal. But before the vote could begin, a young woman walked in, carrying a thick folder. She was Jessica Bradford, Thomas Bradford's daughter, who had graduated from Atlanta Central 3 years ago. "I have something the board needs to see," Jessica announced, her voice shaking but determined. She distributed copies of emails and documents that revealed her father's involvement in discriminatory practices at his own business, including screenshots of him mocking diversity initiatives and explicitly stating his intent to maintain racial hierarchies in educational institutions. Bradford's face drained of color. "Jessica, you're betraying your family," he sputtered, but she stood firm. "No, Dad, I'm finally being honest. Remember when you made me straighten my hair before every college interview? When you told me to use my middle name, Elizabeth, instead of my Chinese first name? I've watched you systematically try to erase parts of who I am, just like you're trying to erase these students' identities." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Several of Bradford's supporters quietly gathered their things and left, distancing themselves from his exposed bigotry. Local news reporters furiously took notes, their cameras capturing every moment. Sarah Mitchell stood up, her voice steady and clear. "Mr. Bradford's true motivations are now clear, but they've actually helped prove our point. This isn't about maintaining academic standards. It's about maintaining systems of power that have hurt students for generations." Carla Robinson called for order and proceeded with the vote. The result was decisive. Bradford's proposal was rejected 11-2. But they weren't finished. The board then voted to expand the diversity program district-wide, using Atlanta Central's success as a model. As the meeting concluded, Sarah was presented with an unexpected honor, the district's first Excellence in Inclusive Education Award. Maya and her classmates had secretly nominated her, citing her journey from enforcing discriminatory policies to becoming a champion for change. "Real leadership," Sarah said in her acceptance speech, "isn't about never being wrong. It's about being willing to learn, to grow, and to fight for what's right once you understand it. Every student deserves to feel proud of who they are." The aftermath brought more changes. Bradford resigned from his positions on various community boards after his emails went public. His diversity training company lost several major contracts, and a state investigation was launched into his business practices. 1 month later, at the school's graduation ceremony, Maya stood at the podium as valedictorian. Her natural hair crowned her head like a halo under her graduation cap. "When I was kicked out of class last year for wearing my hair naturally, I never imagined it would lead to this moment," she began. "But sometimes the greatest changes come from the most painful experiences." She looked at Sarah, who sat among the faculty, tears in her eyes. "Ms. Mitchell taught us something more valuable than any textbook lesson. She showed us that change is always possible, that growth is always an option, and that standing up for what's right is always worth it." The ceremony ended with an announcement. Atlanta Central would host the state's first conference on inclusive education the following year. The school that had once been a battleground for cultural acceptance had become a beacon of hope and change. Sarah and Carla stood together at the reception afterward, watching students celebrate with their families, each one unique, each one proud. each one free to be themselves. "You know," Sarah said, "when Maya first walked into my classroom with her natural hair, I thought I was seeing a challenge to authority. Now I realize I was seeing the future." Carla smiled. "And the future looks beautiful in all its diversity." As the sun set on the graduation celebration, the school's new motto gleamed on the wall: "Excellence through authenticity." It was more than just words now. It was a promise to every student who would walk through those doors. "You belong here, exactly as you are."